welcome. Here I am going to be teaching how to put binding on a quilt, both the front and the back. I'm Jenny Jackson and I'm so excited to do my first live video. Hope you're all going to enjoy it. If you want to write any comments, I will read them afterwards and get back to you. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask. So to start with, I'm going to show you how to make some binding, then attach it to the front, and then once it's attached to the front, close it, followed by getting those perfect corners at the back. All right, so first of all, I tend to use a 2 1/4 inch strip for my binding. A lot of patterns you'll find say 2.5 inches, but I much prefer to have a tight binding around the edge. So yeah, strips usually using the width of the fabric. I'm just going to show you some mini ones because I've made the binding, but I just wanted to show you the best way to attach them first. So you'll get your first strip, and if you face that away from you, and then add your second strip across, just like that. So if you've got pattern fabrics, make sure that it's the right sides facing each other. Then what you need to do is you can pin it, and then just draw a line using a removable pen just from one corner to the edge, like so. And then you're just going to simply sew along that edge. Like I said, if you want to pin it, then it's easier and it won't move. So if you just pop it down to your sewing machine, normal stitch length, and go straight across like this. There we go. And then if you open it out, you can see that you have the perfect join there. So the best thing to do is just use your scissors, or you can use your rotary cutter, and just cut the spare triangle bit off there. So you're just gonna, about 1/4 inch, you don't need to be precise because you just don't want that excess bulk. There you go, so you open it like that. What you would do next is open the seams, and you're just gonna press those open. So when you fold over, it's gonna work nicely. Again, obviously you want to make a long strip, so you would just repeat this process with all your widths of fabrics. To work out how much binding you need, you measure the sides of the quilts, both sides, and the top and the bottom, and then I tend to add an extra 10 inches, but sometimes I add a little bit more, so I've got more to play with. If you want to do scrappy binding, the exact same technique that I've just done, you just do different fabrics all the way along. So there you go, you'd have your whole binding. I have a big roll here that I've made for this quilt. So here's a little quilt that I whacked up the other day. I'm sure some of you might have already seen it. And when you're starting the quilting, you choose where you want to start, the binding, choose where you want to start. I usually start at the bottom of a quilt. And as you can see, I folded and pressed this binding here. And you want to attach it with the open edge against the outside of the quilt, like this. You also want to leave a little tail here, because you're going to use that to close the quilt. Yeah, you probably only need about 8 inches or so. It's up to you. If you add if you do a slightly longer binding, then you've got more to play with, which I sometimes find helpful, especially if you're just starting. Most people tend to then clip their binding all the way along, but I don't like doing that because I find that sometimes as you're sewing, the binding might move. So I actually just hold it. So I'm going to show you the way that I do it, because after a long time of using the quilter's clips, I decided that actually I find it much easier to do it like this. So as you can see, I've got my extra bit here, and then I'm just going to take it to the machine and start sewing. I use slightly more than 1/4 inch when I'm attaching my binding to the front of the quilt. I basically follow my normal foot along the edge of the quilt and the edge of the binding. Again, this is because I really like tight binding, and it does give a lovely finish. So to start with, I will just go back and forth once, just to lock it into position. Just a tiny bit, and then we're going to go all the way along. As you can see, you don't actually need to use the clips for this, because you can just slowly go along. I will try and do the rest of it quicker, because I've got loads I want to show you. So you're gonna go all the way along this edge, and you're gonna stop just before 1/4 inch at the edge of the quilt. By edge, I mean the following one you're gonna sew along. So if you just use your eye, it doesn't have to be perfect. You're gonna stop. If you lift your foot up, you just twist it, twist your quilt slightly, and you're just going to sew now to the corner. Hopefully you can see that. If you can't see it, let me know, and I'll take some photos of this step and post them onto my Facebook. There we go. So you're just going to sew to the edge. Simple as that. There we go. So I've sewn along, I've stopped, and I've just sewn at an angle to the corner. Make sure you lift your foot up, but keep your needle in so you can twist it nicely. The next step is to get those nice corners on the front. So you've got your binding going straight along here. You're going to fold it out to what would be your right, and you make a nice little triangle, if you can see there, diagonal. And then you're going to fold the binding back on itself, so that your binding is now going to run along the following side of the quilt that you're going to sew. As you can see there, it's all folded nicely. Now I do use a little quilter's clip just to clip the very corner in place. I'll remove that afterwards. It's just so that when you're sewing, it doesn't move at the start. Just going to go along. I've got my binding. I often clip my roll of binding as well with a clip, so that in case it drops on the floor while I'm sewing, it doesn't all unravel, because I roll it as I iron. There we go. So we're gonna start on this section. Just go nicely, and I do back stitch the end of this. In fact, I hardly ever use a back stitch, but I always use it on binding. And then we're just going to line it up and sew along this corner. I'll slowly show you that corner again, the next corner, and then I'll quickly do the other one so I can show you how to close. So we're just going along. Like I said, this is why I don't use the bindings, because it does, the clips, sorry, because it does sometimes move as you're sewing. There we go. Here's one of the joins I did in the binding, and it's not going to make any difference. You're just going to sew over that one, and when you close the quilt, you'll end up with another joining that looks just like that. So here we go. Going to stop again, just beyond 1/4 inch from the corner. Lift your foot up with your needle down, twist it, and just sew to that corner at the angle. There we go. So like I showed you before, flip away from the quilt, the binding, like this, then back on itself to go along your next line that you're going to bind, and just clip it again. I think my clip's on the end of that one. There we go. So I'll take that one, clip the corner, clip away right at the corner, and because if you clip too close, when you put it through your sewing machine, your clip's going to affect where you want to sew, and that's going to get in the way. And then you'll end up with a little bit of wonky sewing. There we go. So we're going to start, and we're going to back stitch a little bit, and then just go all the way along. I'll take that clip off now, so I've got it. So this is the same process no matter how big or small the quilt is. I thought this was a good size to show you because it's not too small. And we're just going to go all the way along. As you can see, I just lift and replace it every now and then. I actually find it quicker not using the clips as well, because you don't have to stop and unclip all the time, and you don't have to clip it to start with either, and I'm all about doing what I can fast. Right, get into the corner again. And just stop just before you get to 1/4 inch. Lift it up, twist and sew to the corner again. And you don't need to backstitch when you're sewing off to the corner at all. So same process again for this corner, away from the quilt, then back on itself. So it's lined up nicely with the next part you're gonna sew. Clip and sew. So we've only got one more full line to do in one corner, and then we're back where we started, and I'll show you the way that I like to join my binding together. We're going to go down a few back stitches. So even if you use a 2.5 inch width of fabric for your binding, it's exactly the same method, and I would still use the seam allowance that I use, slightly more than 1/4 inch. But then when you're folding it around the back, you'll just have more to fold. So I would still fold it so it's nice and tight. We're just going to go along here. There we go, nearly at the corner again. I'm gonna take a step, sew to the edge. Take off. Right, so we're nearly back at the start now. So you're just going to do your corner like you did before. Yeah. So if we do it like this, here, and then fold it just like that, that's the corner. Fold. Going to clip it again. It's my clip over there, yep. And we're just going to sew a little way along this time. So I'd sew about 5 inches or so, because I like to have a big gap to close mine, because I find that if you don't have a big gap, it's just quite hard to line up the binding. So the bigger gap you have, the more playroom you've got. So just going to sew a little way along this. Binding is my favourite part, one of my favourite parts, but I absolutely love it. I think it's because you're in anticipation, you know that once, oh, typical, just cut the fabric instead of going backwards. Not the fabric, the thread. Yeah, so it's the anticipation of knowing your quilt is nearly finished, and you know that you're on the last hurdle and you're going to have a beautiful quilt at the end. And also I find it quite therapeutic, because it is just, especially the hand sewing on the end. Right, so seeing how long I've got, there we go. I'm going to back stitch a couple so it doesn't come undone while I'm closing it. There we go. So we've got it attached here. I'm just going to take it over to the side of the machine now. And as you can see, I've got a nice big gap here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take both sides in, and I'm going to fold back on itself, the side that you've just finished sewing. And I'm going to do the same with the first side. Gonna have to use a bit more on that side, because you need the same width of the binding on this side free to cut. So if we fold that, then we bring this one Again, I use just, I leave a gap slightly more than an inch. As you can see here, I've just finger pressed it, and you can see the little gap just over 1/4 of an inch. Then on the side that you've just finished sewing, I'm just going to snip along that folded line. There we go. You see that there? And then throwing that binding away, but I need it. If you open up any of the spare binding you have, if you've done it so precise you don't have any, just remember how whatever width you cut your binding, you now need to cut this little tail here. So what I tend to do is, because I usually have extra binding, just lie it on there and just snip the excess off. There you go. So you've got, as you can see, that will overlap slightly. So just going to get my pins, because I do tend to pin a little bit for this. You can draw a line as well if you find it easier to follow a line. Right, if you open both your bindings like this, and you're going to take the binding, how shall I explain this part you started with, this side, over the top of your last part of binding that you sewed, and twist it so that you're basically doing what you did when you first joined the quilt. This is why I like a big gap. If you've only left a tiny gap, it's going to be really hard to like twist your fabric and then get it in the machine to sew the line. So here we go. This is where I pin. So I tend to pin just at the bottom here, and still lining it up. Gonna do it just here. So from here, you want to sew a line across like this. This is just like when you are joining the binding to make the long strips. So you can just draw a line from there to there. In fact, I'll draw it for you because it might be easier for you to see on the camera than me just popping it on the machine. So I'll just take my ruler and join corner to corner the diagonal line exactly the same as I did when I was making the binding at the start. There you go. See that there? And you're just going to take that over to your machine and sew across that line. Again, as you can see, I've got that big gap to play with, so it's not going to interfere and just be awkward. I've got loads of room to sew. So just going to, oh, we've come unthreaded. Let me just thread that quickly, and then we'll be able to get back onto it. I'm just going to cut that side. Always the way of doing something live, isn't it? Something's got to happen. Oh, now I can't thread it. There we go. All threaded and ready to sew. So we're back where we were. Just going to sew along that line that I drew. Moved a bit now, haven't we? There we go. So you just sew along that line. Like so. Take your pins out, and if you just flip it out, you can see that it's all joined and everything's fine. There's no twists, because if you don't, when you're placing the two fabrics together, if you accidentally twist it, you'll get like a bit of like this, so you need to undo it and start again. Right, so we're going to do what we did before and just snip off this extra triangle here, because you just don't need it. Leave a little bit of a seam. Like I said, 1/4 of an inch is plenty. You can just finger press this. You don't need to pop it on the machine now, because you're just going to finger press it open, seam you've just sewn, then fold it over nicely, and you've got your binding join. So you're just going to take that back to the machine and close the binding up totally. You might want to do some back stitches. It's fine, it shouldn't come undone because you're not going to be that forceful with it at all. a bit of movement then. Oh, I've moved it, but it's fine. It's amazing what sewing standing up is a challenge compared with sewing sitting down. I've just totally moved this, but it's fine. Right, so that is a completed binding. As you can see, oh, there's my clip. It's all attached perfectly on. And this is the bit that I think people struggle with, is sewing on the back. I never machine sew the front and the back. I always do it this way because I find it really therapeutic as a last part of the quilting process. So now I will use my quilter's clips to clip the binding on the back, but I don't use a lot. I kind of sew as a clip as I go. I'll clip a few. So what I'm going to do is take my binding. I start just by a corner, a bit further along from a corner, and I'll fold it over like so. You just fold it over like this. As you can see, because I've used that slightly larger seam allowance, and I've only used 2 1/4 inch width of binding, can you see how nice and tight that binding is? So if you just clip one clip like this, and then we're going to go round the corner, and I'll show you how I get those. I think it's a combination of all the techniques that helps you end with that perfect corner. There we go. I tend to clip quite a lot near the corners. So to get this perfect corner, fold it all the way across to the end, and then flip it forward like this, and there you go. You can see that your corner is going to end up perfect. Clip that one, keep it nice and in place, because then what I will do is I will fold a little further along of the next line of binding. You can see it's moved slightly there, but I will play with that when I start sewing, just to move it back into position. Or just before, there you go. It's literally just a case that the quilting clip didn't hold it properly. So I'm only going to show you how to sew one corner of the binding, because it hand sew on the back, because it is just the same process, and obviously hand sewing takes quite a while, so you'll all get totally bored watching that. Right, so I use just a little whip stitch. So I've already knotted my needle, and we'll start here. I actually just place my needle in like this, just catch the backing fabric, just so that knot is nice and hidden. You can always tuck any loose ends you have in. And you're just going to go up and catch the tiny corner of the binding, and you are just going to do a little whip stitch along, catching, not going all the way through the quilt. You don't want these stitches to show on the front. It's going to catch the binding and the backing fabric and go along nicely. Now it's totally up to you how close together you want to do the stitches. I tend to do them quite close together, because then it's going to hold it in place and it's going to last forever. For this video, I am doing them quite far apart, so it's quicker. So we're just going along. I mean, you won't really be able to see these stitches because you are only catching the tiniest bit of binding, like so. Just unclip as you go. But also, the reason why I don't clip the whole binding on the back as I go is because it does actually surprisingly make the quilt a lot heavier to hold. So I will just usually clip about, for this size quilt, I would clip halfway along one side, but for the, if it's a massive quilt, I would only clip, say, 15 inches along. Right, so when you get to the corner here, you just go down, and then when you go up next, if you just try and catch both this side of the fabric and that side of the fabric, the binding, you can just get both bits in the corner like so. I'm not sure how clear you're going to see it, that's why I explained it. You see I've got both this, then this, and then I'm going to go down and start again on this side of the binding here. Like I said, if anybody wants some photos of this and step by step, I'll be happy to do it. So yeah.
John's watching, by the way.
So there we go. And we're on to the next side of the binding, which we'll carry on. Let me do a few stitches and then I'll unclip and you can see how perfect that corner is. It's so satisfying. There we go. You've got a perfect corner with both parts of the binding matching in the corner, and it's nice and neat. So if you follow all the steps from using the 2 1/4 inch or 2 1/2 inch, but you will end up with more binding showing on the back because you'll have further to pull. Don't leave it baggy unless that's the look you're going for. But also if you're doing a baggy binding, that's actually harder to get the perfect corners because you haven't got that tautness of the fabric keeping it nice. So 2 1/4 inch binding strips. When you're sewing it onto your machine, use slightly more than 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you've got a normal foot on, just follow the foot, edge of the quilt and the binding. And then when you pull it over, you have just got the perfect amount to go just beyond the line that you've sewn from the front. Because obviously you don't want that line. So you can pull it nice and tight. So let me just unclip those. And we've got, to pop my needle in there so I don't lose it. The perfect corner. Right, that's it. I hope I helped you with your binding. Like I said, any questions, write them in the comments and I'll be more than happy to get back to you and help you. All right, thank you for watching. Bye.